don't forget the two most important things to do in this exam. The first one being that you must compare the Russian rulers and you must explain your comparisons. And two, you must support your comparisons with specialist knowledge. It might be a good idea to take notes while listening to this podcast so that you can take down some knowledge that you can then memorise. Overcrowding and poor housing conditions were features of Russian towns and cities throughout this period, and they were made worse by the industrialisation of Russia. The rate of industrialisation and the growth of cities meant that houses needed to be erected, but the quality of the housing was not a priority for Russian rulers. They simply wanted somewhere for workers to live that was cheap and meant that factories had a steady enough supply of workers. By 1914, the populations of Moscow and St. Petersburg had doubled since the start of the period we're studying. Historian Hans Rogge has commented that the poor state of Russian housing and the risk of diseases such as cholera which came through poor sanitation meant that the proletariat were bound to be prone to revolutionary feelings. In 1914, over half of all urban housing was made of wood, so it was susceptible to fire. Some more stats coming up, so I hope you've got a pen at the ready. There were over 1,000 towns, but only 200 had piped water supplies. Only 74 out of 1,000 towns had electricity, and this is perhaps the most astonishing when you think what it must have been like to live there. Only 38 out of 1,000 towns had a sewerage system. These were not nice places to live, and they were certainly not good for your health. 100,000 people in St. Petersburg died from cholera in 1910. This did prompt the building of a more modern sewerage system, showing that the government was willing to act, but only when the situation became desperate, and that modern sewage system was only built in St. Petersburg. Sometimes specialist workers' housing was built on factory sites. They would also be cheap, unsanitary, and often had workers and their families sharing beds with other workers and other families. The Bolsheviks clearly recognised that the standards of living in towns and cities was one very key reason for proletariat discontent, and they tried to tackle it with their Decree on Peace, in which they allowed private property to be seized and handed over to those in need. In this way, conditions improved slightly in the early years of the Bolsheviks, but there was only so much property that could be seized, and the problem of overcrowding soon took hold once more. Things got really bad during Stalin's period in charge, which might not surprise you much. In Moscow, in the mid-1930s, 25% of the population was living in just one room. And if that wasn't bad enough, they were living in that one room with another family. 25% of the population, one room with another family. How many people do you know living in just one room? And how many families do you know living in that one room with other families? This fact really brings home to me just how terrible living conditions must have been for so many people. To illustrate how things had actually got worse, the average living space for a person in 1905 was 8.5 square metres. But by 1935 it was just 5.8 metres squared. This is a good stat to remember because it's just the same numbers reversed, 8.5 metres squared to 5.8 metres squared. And it shows a clear example of how the Russian people lost in terms of living space, certainly, which links to living conditions. This all happened because of Stalin's relentless focus on heavy industry and the 5-year plans. Things got even worse than this terrible situation as a result of the Second World War, after which 25 million Russians were left homeless. Stalin never really tackled this after the Second World War. It still wasn't his priority. However, Khrushchev launched a huge housing program, and between 1955 and 1964, the housing stock in Russia doubled, and thus living conditions for everyone improved a bit. However, in one final interesting twist, Khrushchev launched something called housing cooperatives, where people from the same workplaces joined together to purchase new housing. But what happened was that professional, skilled, valued workers who got slightly better wages were able to pay larger deposits and often got first pick of new housing as a result. So under the Tsars, the nobility enjoyed considerably better living conditions, and under the Bolsheviks, almost everybody suffered terrible conditions until Khrushchev, when a few lucky people were able to afford to enjoy better living conditions than most other people, which is quite similar to what happened under the Tsars. However, in reference to our question, it appears that the urban Russians lost in terms of living conditions far more than they gained in the period. Rural housing was much the same for the period 1855 to 1964, with most peasants living in what were basic single-room huts. However, with the coming of collective farms, Stalin ordered the construction of special housing blocks, so that peasant farmers would work and live together. However, like living conditions in the towns, these housing blocks were often overcrowded and unsanitary. Displaced kulaks, who were lucky enough not to have been shot or sent to a gulag, were often sent to farms in less hospitable parts of Russia, often only provided with tents or basic and overcrowded barracks to live in. Famine was something that raised its ugly head throughout the period in question, and had been a problem before 1855. Alexander tried to combat the effects of famine by giving Zemstva the responsibility for organising emergency procedures for their area, but there were still famines during the reign of Alexander II. Under Alexander III came a far more serious famine, the famine of 1891, in which about 350,000 people died. And whilst these people were mostly starving to death, Finance Minister Vashnegradsky was exporting Russian grain to generate money for the Russian government. See podcasts on agriculture and podcast on industry. During the First World War, food shortages became so severe that bread queues of up to 8 hours became normal. And in 1918, even though Russia had left the war, or rather because Russia had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gave away the Ukraine, which produced a huge amount of the grain of the Russian Empire, a food crisis became apparent, and this signalled the coming of the unpopular war communism, and its grain requisitioning, which left many to starve. There was to be a proper famine in 1921, when Ukrainian grain production fell by 20%. The Ukraine was back in the empire by then, and the Civil War made food transportation difficult. The famine of 1921 was characterised by rumours of body snatching and cannibalism. Ooh. Lenin ended up accepting help from the American Relief Administration, but he was blamed for acting too slowly and waiting for too long before accepting this help. However, of all famines, the Big Daddy Famine was from 1932 to 34, and it came partly as a result of the effects of collectivisation and partly because of poor weather. But the effect was that many, many people died. Things got so bad that the death penalty was imposed for anybody caught stealing grain, and the death penalty was imposed for peasants who ate their own seed corn, because the seed corn, I assume, was needed to be planted to grow more grain. They were also shot alongside the people who'd been sent to guard the seed corn for not doing the job properly. Stalin also banned any discussion of the grain crisis. Perhaps it was because he hoped that if nobody spoke about it, then the problem would go away. Or it was more likely that he didn't want it to kickstart any uprisings, so he just stopped people talking about it. It's unlikely that even by the eve of the Second World War, many years after the Bolshevik Revolution, that total food output levels had reached the same levels as before the First World War. And by the late 1930s, meat and fish consumption had fallen 80%. Famines are clearly all examples of the Russian people losing more than they gained, and famines were all, periods of time during which living conditions significantly worsened. And so to working conditions. In the countryside, the peasants would mostly work to nature's clock. Yes, they had to deal with the problems of famine, the oppression of the land captains, and the crippling redemption payments, but they did get to control their own working days. That is, they did until the Bolsheviks came along and forced them into collectives. The Bolsheviks also placed severe restrictions on the private market, which the peasants resented, because they'd always struggled to provide enough food to feed themselves. But on those lucky occasions on which they'd been able to grow surplus, they'd enjoyed selling it and being able to buy other products with the money. The Bolsheviks took even this from them. Poor peasants. The conditions for urban workers were absolutely amazing. No, not really, I'm only kidding. They weren't very nice at all. Industrial owners could pretty much do whatever they wanted in terms of how they treated their workers, up until 1882, when a factory inspectorate was introduced under Alexander III, who was known for his reactionary period of rule, but in this case seemed to introduce something for the benefit of the people. The problem with the 1882 factory inspectorate was that there weren't enough of the inspectors, so the factory owners could still do, by and large, what they wanted, and just ignore the laws, because the chance of an inspector coming along was very slim. For example, a commonly ignored law was that children under the age of 12 were not allowed to work in factories. But because of the likelihood of a visit from an inspector being so low, many bosses, don't know what bosses are, many bosses just ignored the rule and employed children under 12 anyway. The Bolsheviks, the party of the proletariat, introduced Rabkrin, Rabkrin, which was their own version of the factory inspectorate. But it was actually less use than the factory inspectorate had been, because it became more of a talking shop, which doesn't mean it was a shop in which you could go and buy talks. It means the group didn't take much action and spent a lot of time discussing the problems rather than actually doing anything about them. For the workers, the new work discipline was harsh, and the fines imposed for not following the rules of the new work discipline were harsher. In addition to that, you also had to worry about being accused of being a wrecker if you didn't work fast enough, and that could mean the gulag for you. The workers did get some gains, though, because in 1903, so we're going back to before the 1917 revolutions, 1903, a workers' insurance scheme was introduced for people who got injured at work. And then, after 1917, during the Stalinist period, the communists introduced bonus schemes inspired by the Stakhanovite movement, so that workers who worked particularly hard might earn a bonus. Overall, though, urban workers didn't gain much and they didn't lose much. They mostly had consistently terrible working lives throughout the period. And finally to civil rights, which boils down to a simple overview. People didn't have many civil rights. For example, under Stalin, even those at the very top of the Communist Party could find themselves purged. Similarly, even Witte was ousted as finance minister under Alexander II, and Khrushchev's he humiliated the members of the anti-party group by giving them humiliating positions. And these people were seen as the privileged ones. Even they could end up losing out greatly just for angering the person in charge. For the rest of society, they suffered differing degrees of censorship. They were at times bombarded by propaganda. The press was usually controlled and people could be arrested on a whim. The provisional government were vastly different from all other periods of rule, because for a few short months, people were free to publish what they liked, join whichever political party they liked, and then generally enjoy civil rights, until the July days when the Bolsheviks would clamp down again. But generally, they got civil rights. During the Tsarist period, if you were Orthodox Russian, then you would not be persecuted. But if you were anything else, you would be. For example, the Old Believer sect of the Russian Church were banned from holding public meetings in 1883 under Alexander III, and the Jews were forced to live in the Pale of Settlement. This was something that was enforced before Alexander II, but restrictions on Jews regarding where they could live continued right up until 1917. The Bolsheviks didn't discriminate against any religion in particular, they just thought all religion was the opium of the masses. Though after the Second World War, Stalin targeted any minority group, including religious sects, that would have been wrong, religious sects, as he believed that they had been more likely to have been collaborating with the Nazis. So, overall, with respect to living conditions, working conditions and civil rights, There are plenty of examples of the Russian people losing more than they gained, or neither losing nor gaining, but continuing to suffer consistently. There are scant few examples of gains, though many of them came with the civil rights under the provisional government, or the housing construction of Khrushchev, for example. And so this was the last of Your Knowledge podcasts on the economy and on Russian society. Make sure you use them properly by making notes with them, as well as listening to them often to top up your knowledge. Good luck with your revision and preparation, and don't forget we do requests, so if you've got a particular podcast you want us to make, then let me know.